Hello students, this is Dr. Miller and I'm going to give you some feedback on the third assignment. This is a tricky assignment. I know that the camera technology is not the same for all of you, and that makes it tricky for me to kind of look at everything. But also, even if you have a camera, there's so much to learn about how to use it. So this is a little bit of a technical assignment and wanted to not emphasize the artistry of photography, so it didn't matter a whole lot if you were taking great photos, but it was important that you understand some of the concepts, and particularly the relationship between f-stop, which is the aperture opening of your lens, shutter speed, and ISO, which is the kind of index for sensitivity for your camera. So what you were to turn in were two photographs of the same subject, one using a low f-stop and one of the same subject using a high f-stop, and keep everything else the same. The next was three photographs of the same subject, and in this one you wanted to keep the subject the same size, but then you're changing your lens setting. And in general, you have wide angle lenses, a standard lens, which is basically what we see with our eye, and then you have a telephoto lens. And if you have a zoom lens, that means you can vary the lens to go from wide to telephoto. And there are different lenses. Some of them will go from like 18 millimeters, which is pretty wide, to 105. And that's a lens I use all the time. It's kind of my go-to lens. You have others that might go from, say, 70 millimeters, which is moving towards telephoto, to 200 or 300, which is very telephoto. So the third one, we were looking for the bokeh effect, and that's where your subject is in focus and your background is out of focus. And it's difficult to do, particularly if you're using an iPhone. If you use the portrait setting on an iPhone, that's really what it does. And it's a very desired effect. If you didn't exactly hit it this time, and not many did, you'll get it. We're going to come back to it. Then we want to have you take 4 images where you're just standing in the same place and you're looking out towards a subject that's in the distance, and you're going through focal length changes or zoom changes. So you don't move, but you either change your lens if you've got a SLR camera where you can switch lenses from a wide angle to a telephoto, or if you have a zoom lens. Or if you have the iPhone, you have to do this using the swipe zoom technique on the iPhone. And then to demonstrate ISO, I wanted you to go from a low ISO, like 100, and go up to a higher ISO setting. And 4 shots kind of stepping through that. The highest ISO setting might be 25,000. I mean, it really gets up there. So you had a total of 15 images that you were to put in a document and then submit. So let's look at some of your work. Okay, so the first one we had was where we have one subject and you have a low f-stop and a high f-stop. And what you discover is that the change of f-stop should result in a greater depth of focus or depth of field. So I didn't really see a great example of this, but here's Trevor's too, and we can see that the subject is these flowers, and this is good that it's the same subject in both parts. So the way it should work is the lower f-stop will reduce the depth of field or the depth of focus, and the background would have more of a bokeh effect. And I may actually have these reversed here. And so this would be, excuse my corgi who's barking away there for some reason. Anyway, I think the one on the right here shows that the depth of focus is shallow. In other words, this stuff back here is more out of focus. That is the bokeh effect. And over here on this one, which I assume had the higher f-stop, notice how the background, even this fence back here, is much more in focus than it is on the right. So that's what you're doing when you're changing your aperture. It definitely changes what will be in focus. And if you know this and you can manipulate it, then you can be a better photographer. Now the trick is that when you are opening your lens up to get that bokeh effect, you might be letting in too much light. So you may have to adjust other features of your phone, such as the f-stop or the ISO. And that's why when you know these three things and know how to use your camera to manipulate these three things, then you can get to be a very good photographer. All right, the next was to shoot where you have one object and you're going through wide, standard, and telephoto. And once again, what you find out is this is also a way to change your depth of field or depth of focus. So when you're really zoomed in here on the right, you notice that the background is out of focus. So getting the bokeh effect can also be accomplished by using a telephoto lens, a longer lens focal length. Over here on the left, where we had a wide-angle lens, you can see that the wide-angle lens will incorporate greater depth of field. It also incorporates more of the image area. So when you are changing to be more telephoto, you're actually not seeing as much of the background as you do on this one. Now, Emma did a pretty good job of keeping the subject in the essentially the same size. It's really difficult to make it perfect, so this is good. And then this is Trevor's take on this one, and he's got a subject, and the subject is approximately the same size in all three of these. The wide angle lens, what does it do? It keeps more stuff in focus, and it also gives you a bigger image area. So in this one, we are actually seeing more of what's back here than we are in this one. Now, the subject is, again, essentially the same size, but the telephoto effect is pulling, distorting the image towards you, towards the camera. So this is wide, this is standard, and this is telephoto. I wanted to do a bokeh effect, and I think Emma really had a pretty good one here. This lantern thing is nicely in focus, and the background is bokeh effect. Now, it could be kind of, if you were to change the depth of field by using a wide angle lens or changing your aperture to be a more of a higher f-stop number, in other words, a smaller hole, you would have more in focus back here, and maybe it would look kind of junky. But when you have the bokeh effect and you really blur out this background, it really helps. A number of you had a little bit of trouble with this bokeh effect because your subject was too close to the background. So this is a good example here where Emma had lots of room to work. Okay, this is Janaya, and she did something I wanted to see if somebody tried lights. And it's not perfect in the sense that really a good bokeh would have something that was a little more in focus up in the front, but you can really do some cool stuff with the bokeh effect with lights. And I hope she comes back and does more stuff with lights, because it's kind of a cool way to do things. Portraits, where you've got a darker background and you have some like Christmas lights that are in the background that'll be bokeh'd out. It's very cool. All right, so in this one, what we wanted to do was to have a sequence of 4 images where you're changing the focal length. In other words, you're going from wide to telephoto, but you're actually not moving. In the other exercise, you had to move in order to keep your subject the same size. But in this exercise, we're going from this extremely wide area. And look how much we see. So when we start to get more telephotoed in, it's the same stuff. There's that same tree. There's that same tree. But look how much more restricted the area that you're taking is, and it looks like it's closer. Now the reality is it isn't any closer. You're standing in the same spot, but the telephoto effect of the lens is pulling it closer. Let's go and get the other 2. So here's this row of trees, and look how in this final one how close they really are. So if we go back and see, these are the trees, and they look so far away, but Trevor didn't move. He changed his lens. Okay. So ISO, and this is one of Trevor's, and I think this is a real good example because there's a couple of things going on with ISO, and it is how you set the sensitivity of your camera. So if you keep everything else the same, then you're starting with an extremely low ISO, like 100, and then you might go to 500, and you might go to 1500, and you might go to 5000. But what you can see is that the camera sensitivity is way more over here. This is almost dark everywhere, and this is all blown out with the light. So just by changing the ISO and keeping everything else the same, look at that difference. Okay, now this one is probably the best exposure of these, but when you get into photo editing that will be starting in a couple of weeks, then you'll find out that this one or this one could probably work. So ISO, we'll look at a couple other examples. The other thing is noise, and noise is the degradation of the signal. And what's happening is when you're telling the camera to maximize its ISO, it's really straining, and it's going to make some compromises. It's saying, okay, you're going to get more light, and you're going to be able to get an image even if it's nearly in the dark, but the price you pay is the signal's quality is not as good. There's not enough light to make the camera produce a good image. Now, it's not bad, and Danielle has this sequence here, and is not as great a difference as I might have hoped, but you can see going from the low to the high ISO does bring in a little more noise. And if you were to look in closely, you would see what's called pixelation, and it's little squares, because in computer graphics, really what you get in a camera is producing essentially a computer graphic. You're going to get those little squares, pixelation, and it's not a desired effect. So you have to make that trade-off. Yes, I'm going to tell my camera we're in a low light situation, but I'll have to live with the noise that it generates. And then this is Janaya Wilder, who took a sequence here, and Uh, Now she's using an iPhone, and you can do a lot of things. I've put some really good material out in your folders specific to the iPhone use. And even if you're using an SLR camera, you're still going to be using your phone to take photos. It's the camera you always have with you. So ideally, when you have the low ISO compared to the high ISO, the lower ISO has a little better picture quality. Now I have to tell you, I really kind of screwed up on this exercise because I didn't ask you to do what you will be doing from now on. And that is when you take a series of photographs like this one from Trevor with the ISO, you need to write down what settings you have. And so for this sequence, what I would have preferred, and this is my fault, not yours, is to have Trevor record what the ISO was, but also what the f-stop and the focal length were too. So those are the three things you're going to try and keep track of. You might want to carry a little notebook around with you and just get used to recording what you're doing and taking notes, really. If you want to be a good photographer, it's kind of a science as well as an art. And the more you know how to do things with your camera and the technology of your camera, the better you're going to be. And the only way you can remember this stuff is to write it down. And it's taken me a long time to really develop that habit, that when I am really trying to do some good photography, and frankly, a lot of times I'll just grab my camera and put it in program mode and go. But you know, if you're really trying to do something good, you're going to need to record what you're doing. So from now on, when I ask you to submit stuff, you're going to put on your document what you were shooting at, those elements of the camera. The other thing that I'd like to ask is, when you submit stuff, try to put one image on each page. And I know that makes a bigger document. If we had 15 images, you would turn in 15 pages. But when you pack them together and they're small, well, for one thing, you can't really see what we're trying to accomplish. So in this sequence here, because they started out pretty small, they're all have noise issues. So we want to do two things. We're going to record what we're doing when we shoot, and then when we create our document to submit it, please put one image per page. There's not going to be ones where we're going to do more than 15 photos, so 15 pages will pretty much be it. But the other thing is, some of you haven't completed this assignment, and there's a couple of you that haven't completed a couple of assignments. I guarantee you, you will be successful in this class if you turn in your work. I also guarantee you that if you don't turn in your work, it will be reflected and you will wind up with a grade that you didn't want. So let's try to stay on task and get this stuff turned in. We will actually be stepping up the pace, because when we started the course, there's two things. One is it was weather-wise. It's been a bit of a challenge. I know this. I've taught this class in the spring semester several times, and I know it's a challenge. I know you don't get as much daylight, and I also know that you all have busy schedules, so it is a challenge. But so far, I've given you lots of time to turn in this stuff. But in order to get through the rest of it, we're going to have to be stepping it up. So you're going to be turning in your assignments every week and maybe a day or two. But we've got a lot to go. We're just completing assignment 3, and we'll probably do 10 or 11 assignments. So there's a lot to this course that's left to go. So if you do have questions, though, please let me know. and try to let me know early. I mean, I get messages from students the day that it's turned in that I don't understand it. Well, I'll help, but when do you go out and do the shooting? Try to get a handle on things and get your work completed. Take advantage of the nice days when they're nice. Get out, get around. Don't just do the same places and don't just shoot the same people and the same dogs and cats. You need to expand your horizons. All right, well, that's it